So I recently finished reading The List, and this book is so interesting because it raises so many really interesting and important questions about abuse, about gender, about social media, about the relationship between the victim and the abuser, and then how that is exasperated or how problems can be exacerbated with social media. So in this video, I wanted to just do a quick review of the book and also discuss some of the important topics that it really provokes, I think. So basically, the outline of the book is the protagonist is about to get married and things are going well in her life. She's a journalist, and she's a feminist journalist, and she writes a lot about women who have been abused, and she was involved in these kinds of like Me Too movements. And then she has this like perfect, or what she thinks is this like wonderful fiance. And then just before the wedding, like his name appears on a list, this anonymous list that gets circulated on Twitter. And he's accused of abuse. He's accused of harassing somebody in a after work party. And then he has apparently a restraining order taken out against him. Like that's what the allegation is in this list. And he's working in media. And so the list is like a compilation of loads of different people who are working in media, lots of different men who are working in media who have been accused of a variety of different forms of sexual abuse and gender-based abuse and harassment. And he is claiming that he is innocent. And so that happens like right at the very beginning of the book. So that's not a spoiler. And so it's kind of how she deals with it, and also how he deals with being accused online. And then obviously he gets like a lot of online abuse because of the allegations about him. And then she also gets a lot of backlash on social media because she is this feminist journalist who was really involved in these other kinds of movements against like other men when other men were accused. And so she's put in this really difficult position because she has to figure out, is she going to continue with the marriage? Is she going to continue with this relationship? Can she believe him? Because he says that he's innocent, right? He says that he's never been to a Christmas party and the allegations are false and he doesn't understand what's happening. But right from the very beginning, we see, because we can see in like his thoughts, right? So right from the very beginning, we see that he's not telling her the whole truth. And one of the, I'm not going to spoil the plot or anything because it's such a good, well-written book that I massively recommend. But one of the interesting things that it brings up is we can see, because of the way she's written it, we can see both perspectives. We can see his perspective and her perspective, and also the perspective of other characters and what happens to them. And one of the things that's really interesting is this relationship between him and what he considers to be abuse, and what he considers to be negative unwanted behavior, and then what she considers to be negative unwanted behavior, and what other characters consider to be. And the way that, like, because he's in these like WhatsApp groups, these like group chats with his friends, and the way that they talk about women in these groups, and the way that derogatory sexualized language is used by men about women in these kinds of like lad chat groups is so normalized. But actually, like, this line between like what is harassment and what isn't harassment, and what is abusive behavior and what isn't abusive behavior, because obviously there are examples of behaviors which are very categorically abusive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the abuser is going to think it's abusive. But then there's a whole other variety of behaviors which are like unwanted sexualized behavior that often doesn't kind of like make the cut. Like, it isn't necessarily considered to be abusive behavior, but it is so normalized in our society that women accept all kinds of things, like in the workplace and in like obviously in social situations and in like friendship groups and in with like people that they may or may not be seeing. And so it's exploring this line between what is abusive relation, what is abuse and what isn't, and how the same kind of a behavior can be interpreted like so differently. But she doesn't take this like a black and white picture as well. He is he's accused of being abusive, and he admits, you see in the book, that he's admitting that he has done things wrong. that he has behaved inappropriately towards women and so on and such forth, but he doesn't classify that as abuse. But I think it's interesting as well because you get like kind of like a little bit like the baby reindeer thing, where he is the victim in it. The protagonist is a victim of multiple abusive relationships, but also you see the nuance of his character, and you see this like how it's not as black and white all of the time. It's such a complicated thing to talk about because I'm not trying to say that somebody who is the victim of abuse isn't the victim of an abuse, but also somebody who is the victim of an abuse can also make mistakes and can also do things wrong, which doesn't mean that the abuse is I'm not saying that to say that the abuse isn't abuse. It is, but there is nuance to it, and how from his perspective, how he feels and what happens to him, and of course because he's online and this is online and he's somebody that has a media presence, the trolls on social media really grab onto him and he starts getting like harassment and he starts getting, abuse, and how that spirals out of control. And then there's another character in it as well. And for whom this person has a bigger online media presence and who is more famous. And then the consequences of that, the consequences of this kind of allegation, this person also claims that they're innocent, right? All of the men on the list, I think, claim that they're innocent. And then what happens to him as a result of these online allegations, and how everything becomes so exasperated through social media. This is making me think about the instance with Caroline Flack. So when somebody receives like overwhelming negative hate online to such an extent that the person cannot see a way to go forwards, and then something tragic happens and afterwards everything changes in social media, and it's hashtagging like be nice, and the reality is that people aren't nice on social media, and the consequences of it are incredibly serious for people's mental health. And that's one of the themes that the book deals with in such an interesting way, is our relationship with social media, our relationship with our own mental health, and how that affects us, and particularly how that affects those who are in the limelight, and how that can, and like the consequences that can have. In this instance, when somebody is accused of abuse, as happened with Caroline Flack, or like another instance of somebody being accused of doing something that's really negative, and then everybody turning against them and being so hateful, and the way that social media just like absolutely spirals, and you can never get it back, and you can't control what people say, and you like don't feel like you can even influence it anymore. It also talks about like what's happening at the moment with this like masculinity, this like crisis of masculinity, where men are like no longer feeling necessarily like they are able to play that kind of caregiver function, but they're still feeling like an obligation from society to fulfill a function that they're not necessarily able to do so. And with changing gender dynamics, that has consequences on how people see themselves. So I definitely recommend it, and it was really thought-provoking and really interesting.